Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Making the CE Marking Multitask, How to Enhance the Achievements of CE Marking to Open More Markets. My name is Sarah Steck, and I'm the Legal and Regulatory Director here at L&E GMed North America. The decision to go global is not one taken lightly by medical device manufacturers. Worldwide, medical device regulations can differ greatly from one to the next. Now here at L&E GMed, we're often asked if a manufacturer can reuse part of its technical documentation for CE marking to meet another regulation. And this makes sense. As regulatory requirements increase, manufacturers look for ways to achieve economies of scale, especially with the most expensive parts of their regulatory submissions, like clinical trials. While there aren't many places around the world that will adopt a CE marking as their own conformity mark, aside from the European Economic Area, the different components and requirements to receive a CE marking can play a large role in putting together a medical device manufacturer's regulatory submission to another country. If you have any technical issues, please let us know by using our chat console, and we'll try and solve everything in the process. Please note that today's session is pre-recorded, so if you have any colleagues unable to attend, or if you yourself are not able to stay for the entire time of the webinar, we'll provide you with a link to the presentation as well as the PowerPoint slides later on this afternoon. During the recording, I'll be here, as well for about 10 minutes after the presentation to answer your questions. If you'd like to submit questions, please do so in either the chat box or the Q&A box that you see on your screen. Now, because we have an important crowd today, we'll go ahead and apologize in advance if we're unable to answer all of them. But we will keep track of all the questions and provide answers to each and every one within the next couple weeks. If you have specific questions you would like to discuss after the webinar, you can either email us or give us a call using the address and telephone number provided at the end of this presentation. Now today we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's see where we're going. First, I'll give an introduction that covers the generalities for regulations and for international medical device markets. Then we'll get into what we're all here for, how to enhance the achievements of CE marking around the world. As you may already know, there are a few moving parts to CE marking, including product and quality management system conformity. So we'll go through some key points and talk about each, product and QMS conformity, and finish up the session talking about the Medical Device Single Audit Program, or MDSAP. And finally, we'll wrap it up where else you can use the resources and the data that you have compiled for CE marking around the world. So now that we know where we're going, let's get started. If we consider the regulations throughout the world, there are a lot of similarities in terms of their objectives. First, the goal for all the regulations is to protect the safety of the public health at a high level. A lot of times, it may seem as though the regulations don't seem to make much sense from a manufacturer's point of view. However, keep in mind that they are meant to protect the public health, and that is what is important. Second, the regulations are written to identify products on the market through registration, marketing clearance, etc. The point of this is to make sure that the competent authority in the country has an idea against what it needs to protect the public health. And finally, the regulations provide the administrative system that keeps everything going, from the conformity assessments to the actual registration. Without this administrative system, nothing would get on the market at all. Now, the regulations are sometimes a bit frustrating for industry and manufacturers, but that is what keeps everything together. So now that we know the basis upon which each country's medical device regulations are built, let's take a look at some key points, product and QMS conformity, and the MDSAP program. Now, before we get into the different types of conformity that come out of medical device regulations, let's look at some key points. First, very early in the design phase, and even with design changes, it's important to keep the target markets in mind. The regulatory requirements and associated standards are data inputs at the beginning of the design phases because they relate to product characteristics and manufacturing methods. For the manufacturer, the regulatory function should be brought into the design phase in order to make sure that these inputs are kept in mind while designing. Now, the second bullet point is to keep in mind that the CE marking itself doesn't apply to third countries. Now, that's to say that simply handing over the CE certificate is usually insufficient for getting marketing authorization. So, you can use it anywhere in the European Economic Area, but it's not a given that it will get you into other countries. However, it's always possible to use the documents and methods that you use to show conformity, safety, and performance for your CE marking submission for other countries as well. Some countries take account of the attestations and/or the evaluation reports to facilitate access to their markets. And finally, an undeniable factor of success is the choice of European notified body that is recognized by many different regulations. This guarantees the tacit recognition of third parties in the competence of the notified body. Now, that last point on the previous slide is pretty important, as a notified body who is recognized for many regulations and jurisdiction is a pretty powerful ally in your corner. As a notified body and certification body, L&E can provide certification for medical device manufacturers to a wide variety of regulatory jurisdictions. L&E is notified to every medical device directive in force in Europe. It also participates to multi-recognition projects and programs like MDSAP in order to offer more markets to its clients. Its participation to recognition agreements, like the CB scheme, also helps its clients gain access to more markets. And finally, L&E has created bilateral agreements with other certification bodies to mutually help clients receive the services that they need. Not all notified bodies have quite as worldwide of recognition throughout the regulatory world as L&E, and L&E is an expert at using this recognition to its clients' benefit. Now, we know that notified bodies are notified across Europe, but your notified body or certification body may also be able to offer easier access to world markets as a result of its different accreditations and recognitions. For example, L&E GMED offers different types of certification and market access around the world. It's part of the ChemDCAS program in Canada, offering ISO 1345 ChemDCAS certification for medical device manufacturers who wish to sell their products in Canada. It is a third-party accredited person program able to perform QSR inspections for the FDA. It has a technical cooperation with the TFDA in Taiwan that makes things easier for its clients who wish to sell their products in Taiwan. And it's also accredited by IMDRF to provide the IMDRF certification for electromedical devices headed into Brazil. Now, like I mentioned, we're going to examine how the different ways that a medical device manufacturer demonstrates conformity of the product can be used. In CE marking, the document that shows the medical device's conformity to the essential requirements is the technical documentation. Its contents are key regulatory elements. The International Medical Device Regulators Forum, or the IMDRF, created an international guide that describes the contents of this type of technical documentation. You may have heard it as the STED, the Summary Technical Documentation. Planning to systematically build the technical documentation according to this guide, taking into account the specific national regulatory requirements, will help to consolidate the requests for your approvals. Now, conformity to the standards is part of almost every regulation. For a test or a validation report that can be used for as many countries as possible, manufacturers should look at using international standards described in the target markets, taking into account any national deviations that may exist. Manufacturers should also do a summary of the requirements in the standards for the target markets, which would help when performing testing to make sure that all the boxes are checked. For example, let's take a look at the biocompatibility standard, the EN ISO 10993. which is a European harmonized standard. But the US and Japan have national deviations with respect to conducting tests or acceptance criteria that need to be considered when conducting the biocompatibility testing. The CB Scheme program, applicable to electromedical devices, proposes a key solution for all the national deviations that are listed. It provides that an approved laboratory, like L&E's laboratory, can do the tests according to the national standards and all the required national deviations. This lab can also issue reports and certificates that are recognized by all the participating laboratories. Now this slide has some other useful points about showing product conformity. The risk management file is a common element in the technical documentation for medical devices around the world. Many times, this is based on the standard ISO 14971. The clinical evaluation, the bibliographical data, are also a common point across the different countries. It is important to verify if the clinical investigations, which may be required to be performed in the specific country, are in fact required. And finally, in certain countries, it's important to take into account the reimbursement policies and regulations for each country. For some, it's important to keep them in mind at the time that you're thinking of marketing clearance, as opposed to after marketing clearance. In terms of the QMS, or the Quality Management System, the reference standard, usually in Europe, is ISO 13485. That's the harmonized standard. It's a common denominator which supports the regulatory texts in various ways. Now first, like I mentioned in Europe, it's a harmonized standard. The Z annexes allow to clearly establish how the standard fulfills the regulatory requirements for quality management systems that are specified in the medical devices directives. In Canada, the standard is cited in the Medical Devices Regulation. The Health Canada Guidance Document, GD210, describes how it corresponds to the Canadian Medical Devices Regulation. In Australia and Taiwan, it is a recognized standard, according to a similar principle as the European harmonized standards. And in Japan, it's very similar to the Japanese GMP regulation, Ordinance 169. The MDSAP program, which we'll go into in the following slides, is a turnkey solution for more than a few countries. Finally, I should mention that ISO 1345 is currently being revised. The ISO Technical Committee 210 Working Group 1 has started to analyze the comments. Like I mentioned before, L&E is taking an active role in the development and revisions of this standard, and as chair of the French Mirror Group, will attend the working group meetings in Stockholm in September. Now, speaking of the MDSAP program, let's talk about some of the specifics. It's a program that was started by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, or IMDRF, that was meant to pool regulators' resources and technology to enhance the safety and oversight of medical devices throughout the world. There are 4 regulatory authorities that are taking part: the Therapeutic Goods Administration from Australia, Anvisa from Brazil, Health Canada from Canada, and the US FDA. Japan and the World Health Organization are observers. Essentially, the goal is that an audit done within the MDSAP program will meet the regulatory requirements for audits for all of these jurisdictions, allowing for faster market access for medical device manufacturers. Now, aside from one audit for many countries, there are a few more principles that the IMDRF used when creating the MDSAP program. First, medical device manufacturers can contract with a recognized auditing organization to perform their audits. The MDSAP program is currently qualifying auditing organizations to perform audits on its behalf. Second, manufacturers would undergo a single assessment of their quality management system, instead of the 4 different audits that would otherwise be expected from the different jurisdictions. Third, that this audit would signify compliance with the requirements of the 4 countries involved in the MDSAP program, making the opening to the different markets a bit wider for the manufacturers. And finally, each country can define how the MDSAP results will be implemented according to its own legislation. Now, there are many objectives that you can see on this slide that the IMDRF wanted to meet when creating the MDSAP program. First, that a single audit would provide confidence in the results for the regulators around the world. One of the biggest issues with medical device regulators is international inspections. The MDSAP program is one solution to help the regulators pool their resources to make those international inspections easier for them. Now, this leads into the second objective, which is to activate the appropriate regulatory oversight over the manufacturer's quality management system while minimizing the regulatory burdens on industry. As regulators are spread thinly around the world, the MDSAP program helps them to really focus on what they need to focus, while maintaining their high levels of public health. Related, the third objective was to promote a more efficient and flexible use of regulatory resources through work sharing and mutual acceptance, while respecting the sovereignty of each authority. The fourth was to take advantage of the existing structures for conformity assessment, like the CAMDCAS program in Canada and the Accredited Persons program in the US, to provide the basis for the MDSAP program structure. This will promote, in the long term, a greater harmonization of regulatory approaches and technical requirements based on international standards and best practices, as well as consistency and transparency. One of the key points of the MDSAP program is the presence of third parties and how they interact with the regulatory inspection bodies. While Australia and Canada have agreements in place that use third parties already, it's not as prevalent for the US FDA and ANVISA. The MDSAP program will not only use the third-party auditors, like LNEG Med's auditors, but the regulatory inspectors as well. By using these third parties, regulators can have a greater coverage of manufacturers throughout the world. Regulators' resources can then focus on the high-risk or problematic devices and those not compliant with the regulations, and surveillance of the auditing organizations. So now that we've gone over the different discrete parts that go into a medical device regulatory submission, let's talk about where else in the world you can use these parts. Now first, I should say that for most of the rest of the world outside Europe, a medical device manufacturer may not be able to use the CE marking itself alone as a way to conform to the specific country's regulations. However, like I mentioned before, the inputs into the CE marking conformity assessment may be able to be reused for other countries' submissions. Now, I just mentioned that third countries don't just adopt the CE marking. However, a few do come pretty close. Now on this slide, you'll see some of the countries that will take the CE marking as proof of the medical device's technical and quality system conformity to its own regulations. Now, most of these countries have caveats, like how they won't take proof of CE marking as proof of conformity for all types of devices, or all classes, or only for specific types of devices. But these are countries in which a CE marking is either required as part of the submission, or it makes things considerably easier. Now, we mentioned the European Union on this slide as a reminder that there are 27 different member states within the EU, and more coming along the way. So it may be worthwhile to take a look to see if there are additional markets in the EU that you're not already currently distributing. Now on this slide, you'll see a sampling of the countries that have similar quality system requirements as that required in Europe. For the sake of simplicity, we're using ISO 13485 as the quality management system requirement, even though its harmonized standard status means it's not strictly required by the Medical Devices Directive. Most medical device manufacturers who place the CE marking on their medical devices use ISO 13485 as their quality system standard. What's not on this slide are the countries that don't specify that they will take an ISO 13485 certificate as proof of the manufacturer's quality management system. Now, you may find that countries may state that they require a GMP certificate. Since it's not the case everywhere, we didn't assume that the GMP is the same as ISO 13485. But some countries' GMP requirements may be very similar to ISO 13485, and so your quality system may be almost compliant anyway. Now on this slide, you'll see a sampling of countries that either require or have technical documentation regulations similar to the Global Harmonization Task Force Summary of Technical Documentation Guidelines. The GHTF, which is now the IMDRF, instead was largely based on the EU Medical Device Directive's technical documentation requirements. So, medical device manufacturers whose products have CE marking would have a similar technical submission for these countries. Now, I should note that Singapore and Thailand have similar technical documentation requirements to the IMDRF guidelines or the GHTF guidelines. Singapore and Thailand use the Asian Common Submission Dossier template, which is pretty similar to the GHTF or IMDRF technical documentation requirements. And in addition, the registration documents a lot of times can be in English, or they have to be in the specific language that that country requires. Now, on this slide, you'll find a sampling of countries where, on the face of their regulations, they don't mention ISO 13485, CE marking, or the STED technical documentation format. In practice, these things may be accepted, although from their regulations, it's hard to say. These countries also ask for a certificate of free sale as part of the registration application. Now, a medical device manufacturer would get a certificate of free sale from the regulatory authority that approved their devices in their home country, and the home country being the country in which the headquarters of the manufacturer is. So, if a medical device manufacturer is headquartered in the U.S. and sells their devices in the U.S., they would go to the U.S. FDA for their certificate of free sale. And that about wraps up our webinar for today. Now, today we went over some similarities that medical device regulations have throughout the world. Then we talked about the different parts of a medical device manufacturer's CE marking submission, which may be able to be used throughout the world to help the manufacturer achieve a good return on their time and money investment when entering a new world market. And finally, we sampled some countries' medical device registration regulations to get an idea for which countries have similar technical documentation and quality system requirements as the ones in the Medical Device Directive. I'd like to thank you very much for listening and watching our webinar today. Now, like I mentioned, I'm going to stick around for the next 10 minutes or so to keep on answering questions. If I don't get to your question, you can email or call at the contact information on this slide. Thank you again for coming to our webinar.